Indiana soybean checkoff dollars support you with many, many, many tools to help you get the most out of your bean. Activate your membership at indianabeanbenefits.com.
I'm Andy Eubank, and our program is brought to you by the Indiana Soybean Alliance and Indiana's soybean farmers, supporting the Indiana Soybean Checkoff. We're at the Purdue Agronomy Farm, and joining me is Bob Nielsen, Purdue Extension corn specialist. And Bob, as we look around the state of Indiana, we see a lot of good-looking corn. Is it really as good as it appears to be?
I think throughout most of the state it is. The one probably big exception would be that area up in the northeast, where it's pretty dry. I was up that way yesterday, actually, up east of Fort Wayne at a Ag Appreciation Day, and as I was driving through that area and coming back, there's some noticeable drought stress in both crops in that area. It's hard for me, at least, to get a grasp of how many acres we're talking in that part of the state, but certainly on a statewide basis, the USDA numbers still put this crop at essentially 3/4 good to excellent, which maybe doesn't put us up in the stratosphere, but it certainly puts the crop up with some of the better crops we've had in recent years.
Talk about the pollination. Has it taken in most of the state, and how does a farmer tell for sure?
Well, no, I think this year, with maybe the exception of these dry areas up in the northeast, I think the conditions during pollination were very good. We really have not had exceptionally hot days. Except for that area up in the northeast, by and large, this crop has had timely rainfall, so soil moisture has been good. The crop's not been under very much drought stress statewide. The leaf health is exceptionally good. Even the plants behind us here, very little leaf disease developing so far, and we always have to sort of knock on wood when we talk about disease, but the crop was healthy. We've not had a lot of excessive rainfall this year like we did last year, so we've not lost as much soil nitrogen, which means the crop is healthier because of that also. So I think in many ways the pollination conditions this year have probably been as good as we've had for a couple of years now. So this would certainly represent an example of an year that certainly got through pollination very successfully. Only a very few blanks on the tip of that ear. But almost every kernel is there, and this ear now it's not reached the dent stage, but it is into the dough stage of development. So at this point, even though it's about halfway through the growing season, and as good as it looks, there's still about half of the dry matter yet to be put down into these kernels. So that's the reason why the next 30 or 45 days are so important, because we got to finish this off. The potential is there for exceptional yields, and if the plant can successfully fill those kernels with dry matter, that's going to help assure that potential.
Let's talk a little bit about yield. Obviously, farmers would like to know right now that it's going to be a great yielding crop. Records, hopefully, for many of these guys, especially with prices as they are. Right. That would be nice. Right. What's the potential for that, and how can I go in my field and get a better, more scientific clue about that?
I think the desire to predict yield is like searching for the Holy Grail, right? There's no perfect way to do it. It's one thing, we can always count the kernels and average the kernel number per year, and we know the population from doing plant counts, but the one factor that we're always left with a bit of a fudge is the kernel weight, and you and I cannot tell that by looking at a ear of corn as to what that number is going to be. So kernel weight alone can swing a prediction by, say 10 or 15% either way. So we have to keep that in mind, that when we're doing the sort of the traditional ear count, kernel number kind of yield formula and applying some sort of a fudge factor for kernel weight, we have to keep in mind that at best we're probably within that 10 or 15%. But at least it tells us if we're up here or whether we're down here. And I think as this crop gets now, say, let's say more into the dent stage is probably where I would start doing these counts, because That way you not only have a better feel for how much kernel abortion has occurred by waiting that long, but by the time it gets to the dent stage, you also have a bit of a better feel on the potential size of the kernels, and so that may help you swing that fudge factor one way or another.
2013, 2014, I believe, were both better than average, well above trend line yields, and we're at that point right now, according to USDA. Does that suggest that's the way it will end at this point? And what's it going to take during the grain fill period, hopefully a non-stress period, to get there?
I think the potential is certainly there. If you look at the historical relationships between seasonal crop condition ratings and the eventual yield statewide, it's actually a fairly good relationship statistically. And those numbers at the moment would suggest that at the end, statewide yields could range from 6 to 12% above trend. Now, the 12% wouldn't even put us in the record category, not quite, but certainly the potential's there for a above average crop. Most of the crop statewide is not quite halfway through the grain fill period, but it's close. And so that means from this time of August through sometime middle of September, that's pretty much what we have left around the state for the grain fill period. And so ideally, what we would like to have would be conditions over the next 30 or 45 days that are somewhat cooler than normal. If you look at, say, the last 3 or 4 record-setting years in Indiana, I believe every one of them occurred during a somewhat cooler than normal summer. And what that translates to is a little less stress on the corn crop during the grain filling period. So, today, as we're talking, the forecast is for 90 degrees. That's certainly not cooler than normal. But I think as long as we can avoid a string of days in the 90s as we move through the next 30 or 45 days, I think that still bodes well for the crop. The other thing, of course, is we certainly like to have the crop maintain its health. And as we look at this crop behind us, this nice healthy green, if we can be looking at this in another 3 weeks and it's still healthy and green, that's going to go a long ways towards reaching that potential that seems to be out there.
What will it take in some of those issue-oriented areas of the state for a rescue, if you will?
Yeah. Well, good question. Obviously rainfall, right, and timely rains through the rest of the season, but certainly there's been yield loss that has already occurred relative to kernel abortion, and eventually in terms of smaller kernels, and that's hard to get back. So I think to avoid, maybe the way to say it is to avoid further loss of potential, those areas certainly need to start receiving rains of substantial amounts, and also in terms of timeliness of occurrence to avoid any further loss. So it's just, it's one of those things that you never like to see that happen to anybody, especially in a year like this where the rest of the Corn Belt appears to have such good potential and the impact that's going to have on prices. And so, the worst situation is for yourself to be in the drought and everyone else with great yields and prices where they are. So, but certainly the biggest thing that those areas need from this point forward is a timely amount of significant rainfall. So again, this is a demo where we are trying to show the effects of leaf loss and photosynthetic stress on both pollination and grain fill. So this one we manually defoliated when the crop was about halfway through the pollination process. And so by removing almost every single leaf on these plants, you can imagine that's just a severe photosynthetic shock to the system. You essentially cut off the photosynthate supply, not quite 100%, but close to it. And so what happens then is that kernel abortion occurs because the young kernels are very susceptible to that kind of damage at that point. And so I'll grab an ear out of here and we'll see what those effects look like. So again, this was defoliated on just in the middle or almost the end of pollination. And you see some silk still hanging on at the tip. That tells us that they did not successfully fertilize with pollen. The silks have dropped off the rest of the year, which means pollination was successful, but this has now been, oh my gosh, 3 weeks ago. and nothing is happening on the ear. So what we're looking at is essentially immediate abortion of those kernels due to that admittedly artificially severe photosynthetic shock. But conceptually, the same kind of abortion will occur if you get, say, severe hailstorm, if the plant is severely infected with foliar disease, if it's got severe nitrogen deficiency, anything that greatly reduces this photosynthetic factory from capturing sunlight at this critical pollination period will often lead to pretty dramatic abortion of the kernels shortly after pollination.
The Better Farming series is presented by the Purdue Center for Commercial Agriculture and Hoosier Ag Today. Check out the Center for Commercial Ag's website. You're seeing the website on your screen, and they have right now the details on the newest Ag Economy Barometer at that website, so check that out. Also take a look at Dr. Bob Nielsen's Chat and Chew Cafe website online. I'm Andy Eubank. Thanks for joining us for the Better Farming Report from Hoosier Ag Today, Indiana's Farm Network.
Indiana soybean checkoff dollars support you with many, many, many tools to help you get the most out of your bean. Activate your membership at indianabeanbenefits.com.